The wind howled across the wide and empty plains, carrying with it the sharp sting of dust and grit. The horizon stretched on forever, a pale line between earth and sky, broken only by the jagged silhouettes of mountains in the far distance. Out here in the west, everything was bare, honest and cruel. Sun, soil, storms, and men alike. Survival was a daily duel, and for most who tried, the land eventually won. A lone rider appeared at the crest of a low ridge, her small figure dwarfed by the immensity of the land. The horse beneath her was gaunt, ribs showing through its hide, but it kept trudging forward, following the faint trail that cut across the open range. The rider's name was Elena Marquez. She had been on the road for days, drifting from one forgotten town to the next, searching for work, for bread, for anything that might keep her alive. Elena kept her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a faded scarf. Dust clung to her clothes, and her boots bore the cracks of long travel. But what she guarded most carefully were her arms, her shoulders, and her back. Beneath the coarse fabric of her blouse were scars, raised, angry welts that ran across her skin like the marks of a branding iron. They were the story of her past, carved into her body against her will, and she had sworn that no man, no one, would ever see them again. She arrived at a ranch just as the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in fire and rust. The ranch was not large compared to some she had seen, but it was alive with movement. Cowboys shouted as they drove cattle into pens, dogs barked, and smoke rose from the blacksmith's forge. To Elena's weary eyes, it was a place of promise, a chance, perhaps, to disappear into work and earn her bread. She dismounted stiffly and tied her horse to the hitching post near the barn. The men who noticed her looked twice, surprised to see a woman ride in alone. Their surprise turned quickly into laughter and whispers. One of them, a tall ranch hand with a scar of his own across his jaw, smirked and muttered, "What's this? Some widow lost her way?" Another spat into the dirt and said louder, "Or maybe she thinks she can brand cattle with the men." His tone carried derision, but also amusement, as if the idea itself was absurd. Elena kept her eyes on the barn door, ignoring them. She had learned long ago that silence was stronger than any protest. Words only invited more cruelty. Her hand brushed unconsciously against her sleeve, as though making sure the fabric still covered her scars. Inside the barn office, she found the foreman. He was a stout man with weathered skin and eyes narrowed by years of squinting into the sun. He looked her over, taking in the dust, the thinness, the hunger. "I'm looking for work," Elena said quietly, her voice low but steady. "Work? What kind of work?" "Anything. I can cook, clean, but I came to brand cattle if you'll have me." The man barked a laugh, shaking his head. "Brand cattle? Lady, that's men's work. It's hard, dangerous. Burns, kicks, dust, blood. It ain't a place for—" He stopped, catching the stubborn set of her jaw. Something in her eyes told him this was not a woman who would be turned away easily. He sighed, scratching at the stubble on his chin. "We're short of hands this season. Boss might let you try, though I reckon you'll last a day at most." Elena nodded once. "That's all I ask. A chance." The foreman shrugged, almost in pity, and motioned her toward the bunkhouse where the workers gathered. When she entered, every head turned. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, tobacco, and leather. Men lounged on cots, sharpening knives, patching boots, or playing cards. Their laughter stopped when they saw her. "A woman?" one muttered. "What's she doing here?" another asked with open disdain. Elena ignored them, found an empty cot in the corner, and sat down, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not remove her hat. She did not meet their eyes. Already, she felt the heat of their stares and the weight of their judgment. But she had faced worse, much worse.
The next morning, the work began. Branding season was always brutal. The dust, the smell of singed hide, the bawling of calves as they were roped, thrown, and marked. Cowboys wrestled with ropes and irons heated red in the fire, searing symbols into the animals that would forever mark them as Callahan stock. The work demanded muscle, speed, and endurance. Men staggered from exhaustion by midday, their shirts soaked with sweat, arms trembling from strain. Into this furnace of labor stepped Elena. She tied her sleeves down tightly, making sure no skin showed, then picked up a rope with hands that trembled only slightly. The men jeered at first, making bets on how quickly she would give up, but Elena said nothing. She kept her head lowered, her breath measured, her movements deliberate. She did not fight for speed, she fought for control. Each calf she helped hold down, each brand she steadied near the fire, she did with quiet determination. By midday, her arms ached and her legs shook. The smell of burning hide made her stomach twist. Once, a calf's hoof lashed out and caught her across the ribs, knocking her breathless into the dirt. The man laughed, but she got up without a word, dusted herself off, and went back to work. Her silence unnerved them more than if she had shouted back. She was not here to win favor or prove them wrong. She was here to survive. That evening, when the work ended and the men collapsed into the bunkhouse with sore muscles and bruised hands, Elena sat alone on her cot, unwrapping the crude bandage she had tied around her side after the kick. The skin beneath was already dark with bruise. She bit her lip, suppressing the groan that wanted to escape. In the dim light, she allowed herself a moment to roll up her sleeve and look at her forearm. The scars were there, as always, uneven, harsh lines that told a story she wished she could erase. She traced them with her finger, remembering the night they were made, the fire, the hands that held her down, the voice that called her unworthy. A shiver ran through her, and she quickly rolled the sleeve down again. No one could ever see. No one must ever know. The ranch was a place of hard men and harder lives. Out here, weakness was hunted like prey, and Elena, with her thin body and her scars, was a target waiting to be struck. But she would not give them the chance. She would not falter, not speak, not weep. She would endure, as she always had, for endurance was the only thing she had left. The days stretched into weeks. The branding continued, and each day Elena returned to the fire, the ropes, the calves. The men still whispered, still mocked her, but less openly now. Some had begun to notice that she did not quit, that her hands, though slender, held steady, that her back did not bend, even when her body cried out for rest. Yet in the quiet of night, when the bunkhouse was filled with snores and murmurs, Elena lay awake staring at the dark rafters above her. The loneliness pressed heavy on her chest, a familiar weight she had carried since the day she fled the home that once caged her. The scars reminded her that she was damaged, broken, unwanted. And though she worked among men each day, she remained alone, unseen, a shadow in plain sight. Still, somewhere deep inside, a spark refused to die. A spark that whispered she had survived for a reason, that perhaps beyond the pain there was something waiting for her. But Elena did not dare hope. Not yet.
The first time James Callahan saw Elena Marquez, he thought she would last no longer than a day. He stood on the porch of the ranch house that morning, a broad figure with his thumbs hooked into the bilt of his worn jeans, a black hat pulled low against the sun. At 42, Callahan was already a man whose name carried weight across 3 counties. The Callahan brand was burned into the hides of thousands of cattle and into the respect or fear of men who worked the range. He had built the ranch with his own hands, doubled its herds after drought, survived raids and stampedes, and buried a wife who had once been the gentlest soul in his life. Since then, his heart had turned into something flint-like, brittle and cold. The men feared him, not because he shouted, James never raised his voice, but because he was relentless, exacting, a man who demanded more from others only because he demanded more from himself. He woke before dawn, worked until exhaustion, drank little, spoke less, and trusted almost no one. So when the foreman mentioned they had taken on a woman for branding season, James felt the old skepticism stir in his chest. He walked down to the pens to see for himself. And there she was, a slight figure, sleeves rolled tight, face hidden beneath the brim of a weather-beaten hat, dragging a rope with both hands. He watched her loop it over the calf's head, her boot skidding in the dust as she braced against the animal's strength. Her jaw was clenched, her shoulders trembling, but she didn't let go. Another cowboy moved in to help, and together they wrestled the bawling creature to the ground, pinning it long enough for the brand to sear the Callahan mark into its hide. The smell of burning hair rose in the air. The calf kicked hard, and Elena was thrown back into the dirt. James saw her lie there a moment, wind knocked from her lungs. Any other new hand might have stayed down, cursed or limped away, but she got up. Quietly, without so much as a groan, she brushed the dust from her shirt and went back to the fire for another brand. James's brows drew low. He turned to the foreman. "She'll break," he said flatly. "A woman like that won't make it through the week." The foreman shrugged. "That's what I figured, but she ain't quit yet." James made no reply. He simply went back to the porch, his expression unreadable. For the next few days, Elena was just another shadow moving among the dust and fire of branding season. The men continued to laugh behind her back, muttering that it was only a matter of time before she packed her things and vanished. Some joked that she was here only because she had nowhere else to go. Others said she was just stubborn, a mule of a woman who didn't know when to give up. But James noticed. From the porch, from the corral, even in the dead of night when he passed the bunkhouse, he noticed. He saw her hands raw and red, wrapped in strips of cloth because the rope burned her skin until it blistered. He saw her stagger when the cold morning winds cut through her thin blouse, but never once complain or ask for more. He saw the calf's hoof strike her ribs again, dropping her to her knees, and still she rose as if answering some silent command only she could hear. It stirred something in him that he could not name. James was not a man easily moved. The men who worked for him broke bones, cursed the sky, bled into the dust. That was ranch life. He had buried too many to waste thought on the weak. And yet when his gaze fell on Elena, he found himself waiting for the moment she would quit, and strangely unsettled when she never did.
At supper, he sat at the head of the long table in the ranch house. The men crowded the benches, shoving bread and beans into their mouths with loud talk. Elena sat at the far end, silent, eating slowly, her eyes fixed on her plate. She seemed to belong and not belong all at once, present but apart, a shadow clinging to the edge of the light. Once James caught her looking up. Their eyes met across the long table. Her gaze was steady, unreadable, a pair of dark eyes that carried something he recognized, though he couldn't place it. A hardness, yes, but beneath that, a quiet strength, a will like tempered steel. She dropped her gaze first, returning to her plate. The weeks dragged on, the branding fire burning day after day until the sky itself seemed filled with smoke. Elena endured. Her frame grew leaner, tougher. Her movements, once tentative, became sure. Though she still stumbled, still fell, she always rose again. The men began to mock her less openly, though some still smirked when her hands trembled. Yet James saw the change in them. Respect was a slow seed, but it had begun to take root. One evening, as the sun sank in molten colors behind the ridge, James lingered by the pens longer than usual. He watched as Elena tied a calf down with a younger hand who clearly struggled. The boy cursed, fumbling with the rope, nearly losing the animal. Elena's voice was calm, low. "Hold steady," she told him. "Don't fight it. Guide it." The boy did as she said, and together they brought the calf to the ground. The brand hissed, smoke curling, and the calf bawled. The boy let out a breath, relief flooding his face. Elena only nodded, wiped her forehead with her sleeve, and went on to the next. James found himself almost smiling, a rare thing, a thing he barely remembered how to do. That night, as he sat alone in his office with the ledgers open, James's thoughts drifted back to her. The lamp cast a warm glow over the paper, but his mind wandered to the dust, the fire, the way her jaw set when pain racked her body. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey, staring into the amber liquid, and wondered why a woman like that had come here at all. What drove her to a place where scars deepened and the land took more than it gave? He thought of his late wife, Grace, and the softness she had carried into his hard world. She had always believed there was strength in gentleness. Elena was different, harder, forged by something brutal. Yet there was a similarity. Both women had carried storms in their silence, and both had endured. James set the glass down and leaned back, exhaling through his nose. He told himself he was only curious, that it meant nothing. But in truth, something inside him had shifted, though he could not admit it. The next morning, frost lay thick on the grass. The men cursed the cold, their breath fogging as they trudged to the pens. James walked among them, silent as always, his eyes scanning the herd, the fire, the hands. When he reached Elena, she was already working, sleeves tight, hat pulled low, the scars of her hands hidden beneath strips of cloth. She looked up briefly, meeting his gaze. "You'll never make it through the season," he said quietly, his voice firm, not cruel, but matter-of-fact. Her lips tightened, but she didn't answer. She simply bent back to her work. James lingered a moment longer than necessary, then walked on. But as he did, he felt the lie of his own words, because even as he had spoken them, a part of him no longer believed it. Day after day, he watched her. The ranch ran as it always had, cattle bawing, men sweating, fires hissing. But for James Callahan, something small and dangerous had begun to grow. Respect. Perhaps even admiration. And though he would never say it out loud, he found himself looking for her in the dust, listening for her voice, watching the way she stood back up each time the world knocked her down. The men still saw only a scarred woman, quiet and ordinary. But James Callahan, cold ranch boss, had begun to see something else entirely. A strength that mirrored the land itself, battered by storms,
yet unbroken. A strength that unsettled the walls he had built around his own scarred heart.
The sun blazed high over the branding pens, its heat mixing with the fire that hissed at the center of the corral. The smoke of scorched hide curled into the sky, a bitter stench that clung to clothes and hair. Men worked in pairs, roping calves, pinning them to the ground, pressing the glowing arms to their skin. Sweat streamed, tempers flared, curses flew, but the work did not slow. Branding season never waited for weak hands. Elena worked as she always did, silently, doggedly, her eyes focused on each calf as if the world ended there. The rope burned her palms, the dust stung her throat, and still she pressed on. James Callahan leaned against the fence a short distance away, arms folded, his hawk-like gaze sweeping the corral. He had said nothing to her in days, but his eyes lingered longer than he meant them to. Then it happened. One of the calves bucked harder than most, wrenching against the ropes with violent strength. Elena fought to hold her ground, the muscles of her arms straining as she leaned back with all her weight. The calf twisted suddenly, the rope jerking, and Elena was pulled to the dirt. Her blouse caught on a splintered board, tearing across her shoulder in a harsh rip. She gasped, scrambling back to her feet, but it was too late. The cloth fell away enough for everyone to see. A web of scars marred her shoulder and upper arm, long angry welts that had long since healed, but never faded. The marks were uneven, jagged, the kind left by leather or iron. They stretched down her skin in ridges of pale flesh, cruel reminders of pain carved into her body. For a moment silence fell over the pen. The men froze, eyes fixed on her. Then the whispers began. "Sweet Lord," one cowboy muttered, spitting into the dirt. "Looks like she tangled with the devil himself," another sneered. Laughter rippled through the ranks, low and merciless. One voice, crueler than the rest, cut above the others. "Know what kind of scars those are? That's a mark of shame. Probably some hussy who got what she deserved." The words landed like stones. The men laughed again, some shaking their heads, others muttering that no decent woman bore scars like that. Elena stood frozen, her chest rising and falling in shallow bursts, her dark eyes burning with humiliation. She clutched at the torn fabric, trying to pull it closed, but the damage was done. Every whisper sliced deeper than any whip had ever cut her. James's jaw tightened as he heard the jeers. He did not join them, but he did not stop them either. His silence weighed heavy, and Elena felt it most of all. Her face crumpled for only an instant before she turned away. Without a word, she dropped the rope, left the pen, and strode across the yard. No one followed. No one stopped her. That night the ranch was loud with laughter, cards, and boots scraping across the floorboards, but Elena's bunk was empty. James noticed. He sat in his office with the lamp burning low, trying to focus on ledgers, on cattle counts, on anything but the image of her scars. The ridges of pain burned into her skin replayed in his mind again and again. Not shameful, not filthy, no. He had seen scars like that before, too many times. They were the handwriting of cruelty, of someone who had once wielded power with merciless hands. At last, James shoved back his chair and stood. The night air was cool when he stepped out, the ranch hushed except for the distant laughter of men in the bunkhouse. He walked past the corrals, boots crunching against gravel, until he reached the stables. And there she was. Elena sat on the ground beside one of the stalls, her knees drawn up, her face buried in her arms. Her shoulders trembled with quiet sobs she had tried to stifle. The horses shifted restlessly, as if aware of her sorrow. A lantern burned dimly near the tack room, casting a faint glow over her tear-streaked face when she finally looked up.
James paused in the doorway, his broad frame filling it. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, he spoke.
You plan to leave? Her voice cracked as she answered, barely above a whisper. Yes, tonight. James stepped closer, his spurs jingling faintly. Running solves nothing. Elena's head snapped up, her dark eyes flashing. Staying solves less. You heard them. You saw how they looked at me. To them, I'm filth, a mistake. And maybe they're right. Her words trembled with rage and despair, but James only stood there, watching her. After a silence that seemed to stretch into eternity, she whispered, "You think the same." "I don't," James said, his voice steady. Elena gave a bitter laugh, harsh as broken glass. "Then you don't know what those scars mean." She hesitated, her hands clutching her torn blouse. Then, with a sharp inhale, she pulled the fabric aside, baring the ridged flesh beneath. "These aren't from an accident, not from any noble fight." Her voice shook as she forced the words out. "They're from a whip. My father," she broke off, swallowing hard. "My father gave me away to a man twice my age, a man who drank, who raged, who thought I was his property. When I ran, when I tried to save myself, he found me, and he beat me until my skin tore open. He said the scars would remind me what happens to women who don't obey." Her breath caught, her voice collapsing into silence. Tears tracked down her face, and she lowered her gaze, ashamed to have spoken. James' chest tightened. He had heard stories like this before. He had seen cruelty carved into flesh, and though he was not a man who offered words easily, something stirred in him that refused to let her believe she was alone in her pain. He stepped forward slowly, then pulled off his gloves. His hands, broad and scarred, came into the lantern light. The calluses were thick, the knuckles swollen, the skin cross-hatched with old wounds. He held them out to her without a word. Elena looked up, startled. "These," James said quietly, "are the price of the life I've lived. Rope burns, knife cuts, broken bones. Not the same as yours, maybe, but scars just the same." He let the silence linger, his steady gaze locking with hers. "Scars don't make us less. They prove we're still here." For the first time, Elena's breath eased. Her trembling slowed. She stared at his hands, rough and battered, then at her own arms. Slowly, painfully, she let the blouse fall back into place. James didn't touch her. He didn't move closer. But something had shifted in the shadows of the stable, something quiet and undeniable. Elena wiped her face with her sleeve. "Why tell me this?" "Because," James said, pulling his gloves back on, "because you need to know there's nothing filthy about surviving." The words hung in the air between them. Outside, the wind carried across the open plains, cold and sharp. Inside, among the smell of hay and horses, a fragile truth settled like embers on dying coals. For the first time since she'd come to the ranch, Elena felt a thread of something she hadn't dared to hope for. Not pity, not even kindness. Respect. James Callahan turned toward the door, pausing before he stepped out. "Be at the pens at dawn. You've got work to finish." Elena blinked, startled. "You mean I can stay?" He glanced back over his shoulder, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "You leave if you want, but if you stay, you'll finish the season. That's all there is to it." Then he was gone, his footsteps fading into the night. Elena sat there long after, the lantern flickering at her side. Her tears had dried, but her heart beat differently now. For once, the weight of her scars didn't feel so unbearable, because someone she least expected, had looked at them and seen not shame, but survival. The storm rolled in without mercy. Clouds as black as coal swarmed across the horizon, and by dusk, the Callahan Ranch was swallowed by a restless wind that howled like wolves loose in the dark. James had known it was coming. He'd read the sky since he was a boy, but no knowledge could soften the dread that swept through the bunkhouse when the first sheets of rain came down. By lantern light, the ranch hands scrambled to brace the fences. The cattle, restless even in calm weather, now roared and thundered against the corral rails, their hooves pounding like war drums. Thunder cracked so loud it seemed to split the earth, and lightning carved the sky in jagged veins of fire. Elena pulled her coat tight around her shoulders and followed the men outside. She had no place in the bunkhouse when the herd was in danger. She was part of the ranch now, and the ranch needed every set of hands. Mud clung to her boots, sucking at each step, but she forced herself forward. James stood at the front, his slicker flapping in the storm. His hat brim dripped with rain, his face set like stone. His voice cut through the chaos, sharp and steady. "Move 'em toward the south pen. Keep the calves tight. Don't let the herd split." Elena grabbed a lantern and ran to flank the younger hands. Fear clawed at her chest. This was no Brandon fire, no quiet work in the daylight. This was raw survival, both for the herd and for those who dared stand among them. The cattle surged, 200 head, eyes wild and white under the storm's fire. A frightened steer broke the line and bolted toward the fence. Elena lunged, swinging her arms wide, driving it back toward the herd. Mud splashed up her legs, rain stung her skin, but she held her ground. Hours blurred into minutes, minutes stretched into eternities. The rain hammered down, turning the corral into a pit of muck. A scream rang out as one ranch hand was thrown aside by a steer's shoulder. Others rushed in, ropes flying, curses torn away by the storm. And then it happened. One of the biggest bulls, maddened by lightning, broke loose. It charged into the chaos, head down, horns glistening with rain. The men shouted, scattering, but Elena was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The beast thundered toward her, hooves crushing the ground, a wall of flesh and fury. For a heartbeat, she froze. She saw her end in those rolling eyes, in the spray of mud flying up from its hooves. She thought of her mother's voice, of the night she ran from her father's house, of the scars carved into her body that had haunted her every day since, and she thought perhaps this was the way her story ended, trampled nameless beneath the storm. But before death could claim her, another shadow cut across the rain. James. He threw himself into the bull's path, grabbing Elena by the arm and yanking her clear. The force of the beast's shoulder clipped him, sent him crashing into the mud, but not before he shoved her into safety. She tumbled into the muck, the breath knocked from her lungs, and when she blinked the rain from her eyes, James was standing again, soaked, caked in mud, and already a rope in his hands. "Get back!" he roared. The men closed in, ropes sailing, horns looping, pulling tight. The bull bellowed, thrashed, kicked against the storm, but James braced his boots, set his jaw, and held. His muscles burned like steel under fire, but he did not let go. When at last the beast was subdued, tied, and dragged back into the corral, silence fell, broken only by the rain. The men stood panting, soaked to the bone, eyes wide with what had almost been. And in the center of it all, Elena knelt in the mud, staring at James as if seeing him for the first time. He was hurt. She saw the blood mixing with rain on his temple, the way his hand trembled as he coiled the rope again. But he was alive. He was there. And she realized in that instant that for all his gruffness, for all his walls of silence, James Callahan would risk his life for hers without a second thought. By dawn, the storm had spent itself out. The herd was battered but alive, penned once more. The men staggered back to the bunkhouse, exhausted, some injured, some limping, but none gone. Inside the main house, Elena sat by the hearth, wrapped in a blanket, her body still shaken from what had happened. James came in last, his broad shoulders dripping rain, his face pale with fatigue. He set his hat aside and crouched near the fire, his hands outstretched toward the flames.
For a while, neither spoke. The crackle of burning wood filled the silence, mingling with the hiss of rain still tapping the windows. Then James broke it. His voice was low, roughened by exhaustion, but steady. "You nearly died tonight." Elena stared into the fire. "I know." Her voice was barely a whisper. He turned his head toward her, and for the first time his eyes softened, not with pity, but with something fiercer, something that burned even brighter than the fire between them. "You're stronger than you believe, Elena, stronger than any scar they left on you." She flinched, instinctively pulling the blanket higher over her shoulder. The memory of the ranch hand's cruel laughter still stung. James shook his head slowly. "Those scars don't make you weak. They don't make you less. They're proof you survived what should have broken you." Elena felt her throat tighten. No one had ever spoken of her scars like that. Not her mother, not the neighbors who had whispered, not even herself. She had lived as if those marks were a curse, a shame carved into her skin. But here was James Callahan, a man as scarred by life as she was, and he was telling her they were something else entirely. Her eyes lifted, meeting his across the flickering glow. For the first time in years, she didn't see judgment in a man's gaze. She saw respect. She saw tenderness. She saw love, quiet but unshakable, waiting at the edges of silence. The storm outside was dying, but inside the Callahan ranch house, something new was being born.
The storm passed, and the branding season stretched into its final days. What had begun in the biting cold of spring was now easing into the warmth of summer. The prairie grass shimmered gold under the wide sky, bending gently in the wind, and the herd grazed with a contented calm that seemed almost foreign after so many weeks of chaos. For the first time since she arrived, Elena allowed herself to breathe. Her body still carried the aches of branding season, burns on her hands, the stiffness of her shoulders, the bruises from long nights spent fighting storms and cattle alike. But she had endured. More than that, she had proven herself. Even the men who once sneered at her now nodded in silent respect when she walked by. She wasn't the scarred girl anymore. She was simply part of the ranch. And yet, a restlessness grew inside her. Every night, when the stars spilled across the dark, she lay awake in her bunk and wondered how much longer she could stay. She had never meant to linger. The Callahan Ranch was supposed to be a stop along the way, a place to earn wages before she moved on, before anyone looked too closely at the marks she carried, inside and out. So when the branding ended, Elena quietly packed her small bag. A worn dress, a few coins, and the blanket James had insisted she take after the storm, that was all she owned. She thought to leave before dawn, slipping away with the same silence that had carried her here. But James Callahan noticed. He always noticed. That evening, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, he found her by the pasture, her bag at her feet. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and crimson, the cattle grazing in the glow, the world hushed in that sacred pause before nightfall. "You're leaving?" he said, not as a question, but as a truth already known. Elena's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She kept her eyes low. "I've taken enough from this place. Enough from you.
The ranch doesn't need me." James stepped closer, the weight of his boots pressing softly into the earth. "You think those scars make you a burden. You think they're a mark of shame. But you're wrong. They're the reason you're standing here. They're proof you survived what most wouldn't, proof of strength." Her throat tightened, her vision blurring with tears she'd sworn she'd never let fall before anyone again. James's gaze did not waver. He lifted one of her hands, turning it so the fading light caught the jagged scars along her wrist and forearm. He traced them lightly, reverently, as though they were not wounds, but stories carved into her skin. "If anyone asks me why I'd choose you, I'll tell them this. It's because of these scars. Because they tell me you are stronger than anyone I have ever known."
The words shattered what remained of the walls she'd built around her heart. The tears came freely then, hot and unrelenting, cutting through years of silence and shame. She pressed her face against his chest, the fabric of his shirt damp with her grief, her relief, her disbelief that someone could see her not as broken, but as whole. James held her there, his arms strong and certain, and for the first time in her life, Elena let herself believe she was safe. When at last she lifted her face, the sun was sinking lower, gilding the prairie in firelight. James brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek. No more words were needed. The truth lived in the way he looked at her, the way he saw her, not as a scarred woman, not as a burden, but as the only one who had walked through fire and come out alive, and in doing so had lit a fire in him he thought long dead. Together they turned back toward the herd. The cattle moved slowly in the golden light, their silhouettes stretching long across the grass. Elena walked beside James, their hands brushing, then twining together without hesitation. Behind them, the house and the bunkhouse glowed warm against the horizon. Before them, the prairie stretched endless and untamed, the kind of land that could swallow or save a soul, depending on how one faced it. But for Elena, the future no longer looked like an empty road. It looked like this: the quiet strength of the man beside her, the steady rhythm of the herd, the fire in the hearth that promised warmth after every storm. As the last rim of sun dipped below the horizon, painting the world in hues of red and gold, James and Elena walked the cattle home, side by side, step by step, toward a tomorrow still uncertain, but, for the first time, filled with hope.